Today's story is about such a terrible practice that victimized people in the 18th century, and all those who became its victims were either poor or very troubled. This practice was so disturbing that when people came to know about it, nobody was ready to believe it, and it continued almost until the beginning of the 19th century. The name of this dangerous practice was baby farming, and it is as dangerous as it sounds, in reality many times more horrifying, which attracted the attention of some of the world's worst people. The story begins on a morning in October 1892, when a man named James was digging in the backyard of a house, when suddenly his shovel struck something strange. At this time, a man named Frank Coney was with him, and both of them were digging in the backyard of a Sydney house located at 25 Burren Street. This digging was being done so that the service pipe could be connected to the main sewer line, and James and Frank were completely covered in mud. As soon as the shovel struck, James removed the soil from the top, and both of them froze on the spot, because in front of them was a sight they had never imagined even in their dreams. They stopped their work right there, and in front of them lay a bundle. Seeing which, James first thought that this bundle contained garbage that the old tenants had thrown here. But as soon as he sat down and looked at it, his senses fled. On the outside of this bundle, he saw pieces of flesh, and as soon as he opened it, he found the rotting corpse of a small child buried 1 foot underground. Seeing this, James and Coney looked at each other, and they quickly reburied the small child's corpse. At this time, many thoughts were running through both their minds, like perhaps this was some accident or tragedy that nobody knew about, and this incident had been quietly suppressed. The next morning, both of them returned to work, hoping that they would forget the terrible sight of the previous day. But they did not know that this was just the beginning. Anyway, both of them start their digging again, and 30 meters away from where they found the first body, they found yet another body, and this time it was the corpse of a female child. Now, it did not take long for both of them to understand that finding the first body was not a coincidence, and both these bodies had been deliberately buried here by someone. The police were immediately informed of this matter, after which the New South Wales police arrived at the scene, and Senior Constable James Joyce was standing in the backyard looking at this horrifying sight. The forensic team also began their work, and according to them, both bodies had badly decomposed because the female child's body had been buried 6 weeks earlier, while the male child's body had been buried 3 months earlier. The tenants who were living in this house at this time had shifted here only 3 weeks earlier, which meant that these children had been buried before the new tenants arrived. Now the needle of police suspicion stopped directly at the old tenants, and their names were John Macon and Sarah Macon. This was an ordinary couple who were somehow managing to get by with great difficulty, and they had seen troubles and hardships from the very beginning. John was born in 1845 in South Wales, and he was fourth among 11 siblings who had seen poverty and struggle since childhood. Sarah was also born in the same year in Sydney, whose father worked in a mill and had also been to jail. Amidst these conditions, Sarah's family got her married, but soon she got divorced, which was very rare in that era. Anyway, in 1871, she married John again and began to feel that now everything would be all right in her life. At that time, John was doing delivery work for alcohol, in which his earnings were quite low. But despite this, both he and Sarah wanted to have more children, whether they could take care of them or not. Then gradually John lost interest in work, and by 1880, he started changing jobs frequently because he could not stick to one job for long. He did everything from driving a bullock cart to deliveries, but people now started calling him lazy. And in 1881, he was sent to jail for 3 months on a charge of theft. By 1885, he took up the work of vegetable delivery, and just a year later, his cart collided with a 4-year-old child, which caused serious injuries to the child, and his condition became very critical. Now John was fed up with his poverty and constant troubles, and finally he became the driver of a businessman. But this job also lasted only 6 weeks, after which John said goodbye to work forever. Now he started spending his free time sitting outside the house, and the responsibility of running the household fell on his wife Sarah. Although he was lazy, he always sat and thought about how he could become rich quickly, and would tell his neighbors too that he had given a house on rent from which he received £4 per month. These £4 amount to approximately 80,000 rupees by today's standards, and according to John, he was receiving this rent from the house that his mother had given him. Anyway, however much he showed himself to be rich to the outside world, his internal conditions were very bad, and this was the reason that they kept changing houses from one place to another. This was the time when John and Sarah found a way to earn money, but both of them used this path in such a wrong way that it made all of Sydney shudder. By this time, baby farming was spreading rapidly throughout Sydney, In this practice, parents would place advertisements in newspapers that if anyone wants to adopt their child, they would hand over their child without any questions asked. The parents who did this were either those who did not want to bear the responsibility of their child, or they would hand over the responsibility of those children to someone else in exchange for some money. Many women, to avoid unwanted pregnancy, would give their children to other couples for just 3 to 5 pounds in the hope that they would be raised in a good and safe home. Many poor couples also adopted these children because they received a monthly amount for the care of these children, and this is where that crime began, which meant these children did not get what they deserved. At this time, a disease called syphilis was spreading very rapidly in Sydney, which had affected both rich and poor, and its biggest victims were newborn babies. Many newborn babies were being born with this infection, whom nobody wanted to keep with them, and all these children were handed over to other couples in exchange for just a little money. Because John and Sarah had also started baby farming, children were for them just a means of earning money and nothing more. Whatever money they received for the care of these children, they would spend as little as possible on them and keep as much money as possible in their own pockets. This was the condition of most couples doing baby farming, due to which children would die from disease, hunger, and neglect. To avoid questioning, the corpses of these children were either thrown in water or buried in the ground, and nobody would come to know anything about it because there was no one to search for these children. John and Sarah were carrying out this baby farming skillfully, in which Sarah would convince women that their children would be safe and John would take very good care of them. They would also assure the children's parents that they would raise these children just like their own. But the truth was that whatever children came to them were disappearing. Until now, nobody knew whether these children were dying from disease or from hunger. But whatever children came to John and Sarah did not live long. Every time after making a child disappear, they would change from one house to another so that nobody would find out, and then they would repeat this there. In October 1892, when the first child's body was found, John and Sarah had already shifted to another location, and the police, tracing them, reached 6 Wells Street in Redfern, where both were living. Changing location was part of their plan, and they had been doing this for many years, due to which no one ever suspected them, and parents would trust them and hand over their child. 19-year-old Agnes placed an advertisement in a newspaper that she needed a kind-hearted woman who could adopt her child. Then John and Sarah contacted her. After this, both of them went to meet Agnes at her house, where she had given birth to a child named Charles just 2 months earlier. And then John played his trick. Lying, John said that they had recently lost their own child, and by adopting Charles, they would raise him just like their own child. John and Sarah took 5 pounds from Agnes to raise this child, and along with that, they also said that right now they were living in Cattle Street, Redfern. But soon, they would shift to a farm. Agnes trusted both of them and handed over her child, in the hope that when John sent her the address of the new farmhouse, she could go and meet her child. But she never saw her child again. Many months later, the body of a child was found buried by police in Redfern Street, on which C was written, and this body was that of Agnes's child, Charles. Agnes was not the only one to be trapped in John and Sarah's web. Rather, they had made many other women their victims. And in 1892, another victim fell into their hands. A woman named Clara Risbin similarly placed an advertisement in a newspaper that she needed a couple who could adopt her child, and she would pay them 3 pounds every month for the care of the child. This time, John contacted her under a fake name McLaughlin and told Clara to come and meet him at his house, which was in Redfern E Street. On May 16th, Clara took her sister along and went with her child to meet John and Sarah so that she could introduce them to the child. Here, too, Sarah convinced Clara that she would raise the child like her own, and John said he was about to open a poultry farm in Rockdale, after which they would shift there. While leaving, John and Sarah also promised that they would stay in touch with Clara and keep informing her about the child. But here, too, nothing like that happened. Just 2 days later, when Clara went back there to meet her child, she was told that Sarah had gone out with the child, and when Clara went a third time to meet the child, the house was completely empty. Now let's come to the third woman, whose name was Amber Murray, and in June 1892, she gave birth to a newborn baby. She also placed the same advertisement in the newspaper that any couple who wants to adopt her child should contact her, and this time, John contacted her under the name E. Hill. After this, John and Sarah met Amber and her child, and their same statement was that they were looking for exactly such a child. Here, too, both of them made the same false promises that they would give the child a good home, good upbringing, and a good life. And then Amber gave them 3 pounds and, completing all of the paperwork, handed the child over to them. Just 2 days after this, John and Sarah disappeared again. after which they were seen in a house in McDonaldtown. Until the trial began, neither of them was very well known throughout Australia, and every newspaper had declared them heartless criminals who had taken advantage of people's helplessness to harm them. For the next several months, no one got any inkling that something very terrible was happening, and no one's attention went to the fact that children were disappearing, and John and Sarah were murdering them and changing from one house to another. For the outside world, both of them were a poor couple, somehow making ends meet, but the truth was that whatever house they settled in, they were turning it into a graveyard. Until now, the police also had nothing by which they would investigate. But that afternoon, in October 1892, exposed this entire case. When James and Coney found two children's bodies during digging, even the police did not have an idea of what they had found and how big this case was going to be. However, a few days later, police found another body buried near Jamie Street, Redfern. But even then, the police could not understand that this was a pattern and the person carrying it out was the same one. Anyway, after finding John and Sarah's old location, when Senior Constable Joyce began searching this house's backyard, he got a sense that there was something very dangerous. Joyce's eyes fell on the loose soil on the ground, but when he dug there was nothing. But it looked like something had been removed from there. This made the police realize that the body, found in Jaime Street, had been removed from somewhere else and buried there so that no one would be suspicious. The clear meaning was that the one carrying all this out was still roaming free. And meanwhile, the forensic team also informed the police that the male child's age was between 5 to 8 months and the female child's between 2 to 4 months, although the identity of these two children still had not come forward. But it was certain that these two children had been buried when John and Sarah were living in this same house. Anyway, now this case was handed over to the senior medical examiner, after which, in October 1892, he formed a jury team that was going to examine different aspects of this case. After this, different witnesses such as James and Coney, who were digging there, the doctors who had done the postmortem, and the neighbors who lived near John and Sarah's house, all were called, because by now, John and Sarah had also been arrested, after which they were presented in court for trial, and then began that case which shook all of Australia. After reaching court, John and Sarah were completely calm and fully prepared. Beginning her statement, Sarah said that after shifting to the McDonald townhouse, they had adopted the first child in June, who had been born just 2 weeks earlier, and they were going to receive 10 shillings per week for her care. After this, Sarah told that the child's mother took her back because they were shifting to Melbourne, and in this statement of hers, John was fully backing her. Now, the senior medical examiner tells the jury members sitting in court that they should not look at how these children died, but rather understand that the ones who killed the children are sitting in front of them, because until now, there was no solid evidence against both of them by which they could be proved guilty. Therefore, the court released them, but their freedom did not last long. Constable Joyce and the medical examiner were simply not willing to accept this decision. Therefore, now both of them began examining John and Sarah's past even more carefully. Joyce now began investigating every house where John and Sarah had lived over the past several years, and on November 2nd, 1892, he reached 25 Burren Street from where the first body had been found. Joyce ordered fresh digging here, and the sight before him shook him to the core. This time, police found 5 more children's bodies from the backyard, which made it clear that all this had been happening for several years. This news became the headline of every newspaper in Sydney and all of Australia, due to which people became very frightened. But at the same time, anger was also growing among them. Everyone's mind had just one question. Who are these people who are deceiving people by becoming caretakers and killing innocent children? Seeing the public's anger and pressure, on November 3rd, John and Sarah were arrested again. And this time, their daughters Blanche and Florence were also taken into custody for questioning. When both daughters were questioned strictly, Blanche revealed that their parents had asked them to lie, and it also explained that if anyone asks about the children buried in the house, they should flatly deny it. With time, the investigation also kept growing, and now the police dug up the backyards of John and Sarah's houses in Botany East Street, Cattle Street, and St. Peter's, in which heart-stopping revelations came before them. By the time November 12th arrived, police found 15 more children's bodies buried in different houses. But all these corpses had badly decomposed, due to which identifying them was impossible. Police were in the dilemma that until any body was identified, how would they prepare evidence? And then one body came into their hands, which turned the whole game around. This was the body of Amber Murray's son, Horace Murray, whose identity was established, and now the police had solid evidence which they could present in court. Anyway, on November 28th, charges of all these murders were filed against John and Sarah, and in March 1893, the date of their trial was set. By the time the trial began, both of them had become very famous throughout Australia, and every newspaper had declared them heartless criminals who had taken advantage of people's helplessness to harm them. People now began to view this case with fear, and everyone wanted that, in court, all the murders would be proved against both of them, because Amber Murray herself had handed her child over to both of them, and his body had been found in John and Sarah's house's backyard, which proved that both of them had killed him. But how the death occurred, nobody could prove. Due to the badly decomposed bodies, it could not be understood how the children had been killed. And then John and Sarah's lawyer said that the child's death was natural, and this is the excuse many baby farmers use so that no one could catch them. Anyway, on March 6th, the court trial of both of them began, in which fear and nervousness could clearly be seen on both their faces. John was sitting with his hands folded and head down, while Sarah was hiding her face with a handkerchief, and everyone felt that they wanted to gain people's sympathy to escape the court's verdict. John's lawyer, presenting his argument, said that no doctor has yet been able to prove that Horace or any other child was murdered. And then the defense lawyer calls Horace's mother, Amber, to the court stand. Amber told the court that she had trusted John and Sarah and handed over her child to them. And when the clothes found on the body were shown to her in court, she immediately recognized them. These were the same clothes that her son was wearing when Amber had handed him over to John and Sarah, and this was a very big piece of evidence that Horace was murdered under their care. The second important witness presented in court was Constable Joyce, who was investigating this case, and he made a shocking revelation before the court. Joyce stated that bloodstains had been found in the children's clothes, and especially inside their armpits, from which emerged the theory that John had used a long needle to kill them, with which their hearts were punctured. This was done so cleanly that no wound appeared on the body, and these children quietly went to sleep in the sleep of death. Now the defense lawyer, with every witness, was trying to make the jury understand that John and Sarah deceived people with the same pattern, and then after killing the children, buried them in different houses. Although all the evidence until now was circumstantial, it could not be ignored, and this case reached its conclusion after just 3 days of trial. All witnesses had been presented in court, and John and Sarah also said nothing in their defense. And then one last time, John's lawyer said that it still has not been proved that these children were murdered. But the court told the jury that they should deliver their verdict on the basis of emotions rather than facts. On the morning of March 9th at 10 o'clock, the jury was ready with its verdict, and finally John and Sarah were found guilty of Horace's murder. But the surprising thing was that this same jury made an appeal for mercy for Sarah, perhaps because she was crying during the trial. Anyway, John and Sarah sat quietly, waiting for the verdict, and then the judge began reading all their criminal charges, one by one. The judge said that John and Sarah made many mothers, their victims, lied to them to take money from them, and also killed their children. According to the judge, it still had not been found out how the children were killed, but so many dead bodies were pointing directly at John and Sarah. Finally, the judge, delivering his verdict, sentenced both John and Sarah to death, after which Sarah fell crying right there and started screaming, "Who killed my children?" By doing this, she wanted to convince the people present in court that she had not committed these murders, and it was a very disturbing sight for those present there. The woman who had herself killed and buried the children was now showing herself as a victim, while John was silently standing there with his head bowed. Immediately after this verdict, John's lawyer appealed in the Supreme Court, and his contention was that the judge had delivered a wrong verdict without evidence. According to him, the defense lawyer had presented false witnesses in court who had made up stories about different bodies, and the jury was emotionally forced to consider John and Sarah as killers. On March 23rd, the trial of this case began in the Supreme Court, and almost a week later, on March 30th, the Supreme Court also delivered its verdict. The Supreme Court also said that there is no solid evidence in this case, but the circumstantial evidence proves that John and Sarah's hand is in this, and the Supreme Court upheld their sentence. Now John and Sarah, with one last hope, knock on the door of the highest court of the British Empire, the Privy Council. However, to take this case to the Privy Council, permission of the New South Wales government was needed, and as soon as this permission was received, Sarah's death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. This was the result of the jury's appeal, who had appealed for mercy for Sarah and said that Sarah had done all this at John's behest. John's death sentence was also put on hold for 3 months because everyone was still waiting for the Privy Council's decision, But on July 21st, John's appeal was rejected and his death sentence was upheld. John now, in one last effort, writes a letter to the most powerful politician of New South Wales, in which he wrote that all the evidence against him was weak and his death sentence should also be commuted to life imprisonment. This time, too, John's request was rejected, and on August 11th it was announced that John would be hanged on the scheduled date. On the morning of August 15th at 9 o'clock, John came out of his cell with some guards, and at this time there was a silence on his face. Even in the last moments of his life, there was no remorse on his face. And in the presence of just a few people, John was hanged. The days he spent in jail before the hanging, only once did his daughters come to meet him, and he left behind 2 letters. In one letter he wrote that he had not committed these murders, and he had been wrongfully framed, and the second letter he had written for his children, in which he had asked them to take care of themselves. How strange is this, that a person who killed innocent children was now telling his own children to take care of themselves. Although Sarah got life imprisonment, she now had to spend her entire life behind bars, and inside prison she was treated the same way as a murderer would be treated. Anyway, after spending some years in jail, in 1898 she was made a hospital attendant, but with time, her health kept deteriorating. She developed swelling in her hands, which made her very weak, and then in 1907, her daughters filed a petition that their mother should be released early, otherwise she would die. This petition was also rejected. But as soon as the government changed, her daughters filed a petition again. And in 1911, it was announced that Sarah could spend her remaining days with her daughters. On April 29, 1911, she was released from jail, after which her health frequently remained poor, and 7 years later, on September 13, 1918, she breathed her last. At this time, her age was 72 years, and the cause of death was heart failure. Although, after John's death, she lived for 25 years, she could never come out of the darkness of her crimes. And in the eyes of the world, she always remained a woman who killed innocent children and buried them. What began from a single body found by 2 poor laborers, this case became Australia's most disturbing case, which made revelations that shamed humanity. Do write in the comment section how you liked this story. Like and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.